I moved here from Kansas 30 years ago, and this was in a time frame where nurse practitioners were not prevalent. And I was always accustomed to going to a nurse practitioner, and I found one who was Kathy Blevins.
A friend of mine who was a nurse practitioner in the Boot Hill, I met her at a conference, and she said there's a program that does evaluations of kids who've been reported to be sexually abused. And she said, I think you'd be really good at doing those evaluations. And I'm like, no, not me, that doesn't sound like fun. And she said, well, actually I have a case in Cape that I need to do, why don't you just come and observe? And so I did, and I observed her, and I have a background in pediatrics too, and I thought, yeah, I can do those exams. And so slowly, I did get involved with the state training and went to state training, and I'm like, well, okay. So I began to do a few exams with Children's Division. In 1996, I met Semo-Nasv.
And in conversations that she and I had, we realized that there really was nothing available for children or adult sexual assault victims in our community other than the police department and the trauma centers, the emergency rooms.
We felt that we could put forth a program that would be helpful and beneficial for children, and do it in a way that would be less traumatic for the children, and also do it in a way that would be very comprehensive.
And she had become very knowledgeable about this approach that was so much more humane, so much more comforting, so much more healing to victims, and so much more approachable than a police department or a trauma center.
Some of the other people we began to talk to about it, they're like, well, why can't Cape, does Cape have the resources to do that kind of thing and do it well?
And we started talking about that and getting a group together. And because I was at St. Francis as a hospital administrator, I was able to help facilitate pulling together some healthcare folks.
In 1997, I came to Cape Girardeau as the new chief of police. And I had been involved formerly in the Atlanta metro area in the development of a sexual assault center for women and children. And when I arrived here, we talked about the problems we were encountering with victims of sexual assault having to wait for hours in the emergency room or at the police department. And I, of course, with other team members, recognized we needed to have a solution to the problem. All of a sudden we got a call, and we were pleased and surprised to learn that there was a movement underway in Cape Girardeau to develop the Network Against Sexual Violence. And I remember our very first meeting at St. Francis Medical Center to put together a team to develop that, which later became NASV.
And we had our first meeting, and we had people from the medical profession, we had people from law enforcement, we had people from juvenile office, we had people from the Children's Division, we had a clergy, we had people from the university, we had people from the school system. We began to meet once a month at a luncheon and began to talk about the problem and the resources that we had. We decided that we would launch forth and actually start a child advocacy center.
And that's how the board originated. I enjoyed many years on the board, and while I was at St. Francis, we were able to just help facilitate supplies and space, and St. Francis was very supportive of that.
As a law enforcement officer throughout my entire career, we've seen the frustrating events involving the network of violence for women and children, and we knew that we had to do something, and so out of that frustration not just in law enforcement but in the medical community and the social work community, we knew that there had to be a multidisciplinary approach to handling sexual violence.
And so that's how we got involved, and by seeing all the people come together, and everybody was excited about doing something that was going to be helpful and not harmful to victims or children, even families, to be able to support them during this time.
And so we were super pleased that we were able to develop the funding, develop the resources, and develop the location. And St. Francis Medical Center played a tremendous role in that. I can remember when we first got our offices in Doctors Park that I was down there helping to paint and helping to get the furniture to make this a reality, and how pleased we were when cases would come in, and instead of having to sit in the emergency room for lengthy periods of time and put them through the turmoil and the anguish of telling their story to 4 or 5 different people, we were able to have a nurse practitioner come in and do the medical legal examinations on site. We were able to have the counselors come in and talk to the women and the children on site and diminish that.
Before we started the Semo-Nasv, a child who would disclose about being abused might be interviewed by someone at their school if that's what they disclose. They might be interviewed by Children's Division. They might be interviewed by law enforcement. And by the time they got to us, we were like number 5 or 6. We're like, you know, and by that time, a lot of kids would say, forget it, it never happened. Even though it did happen, they were willing to give it up because they were tired of talking about it. When a child said to me one day, oh no, I've got to tell somebody else, it broke my heart. And I realized we were not doing them as a justice that we should be doing them and helping them. So that's when we pulled the team together and said, you know, this is the model that we think would work best. And so we were able to provide medical evaluations for every child, and even as we began to see adults, every child and adult that came into our center, able to provide forensic interviews and be able to have the team available in another room observing the interviews that took place. So we learned to ask the questions that Children's Division needed to know about the child's safety, the people in the home. Knowing those elements, we were able to incorporate that in the forensic interview so the child did not have to be interviewed. And over a period of time, we got to the point where if a child disclosed, everybody knew automatically they would call our office, and we were on call 24/7 to be able to go and make that happen if the interview should be done immediately.
From a law enforcement perspective, one of the problems we've always encountered was the collection and preservation of evidence. It's critical to a successful prosecution. Prior to becoming the Chief of Police in Cape Girardeau, I was a special agent with the Army Criminal Investigation Division, and I worked specifically violent crime. And so I remember seeing the difficulties in the different communities, law enforcement community, the medical community, in the collection and preservation of evidence, and getting it later admitted into court to make our cases. We struggled with problems on people understanding the proper way for collection and preservation evidence. To say the least, to have a centralized facility with qualified professionals that know how to collect and preserve evidence, not just physical evidence from the victim's body, but also the testimonial evidence is so crucial. It eliminates all of those problems that we encountered before and reduces tremendously the mistakes that had occurred in the past. So it's a very significant step in making our potential for successful prosecution more of a possibility.
I was the pro bono attorney for Semo-Nasv and helped do the initial incorporation and provided legal advice and that sort of thing. Once I became a circuit judge and wasn't in private practice anymore, I was kind of on the receiving end. And this sort of thing didn't exist when I was first licensed to practice law 42 years ago. And so at that point, when some kid would be abused, he would or she would have to tell their story to a family member or a parent, and then to a policeman, and then to another policeman, and then to a prosecutor, and then to another prosecutor. And there was opportunities for the story to get changed and massaged as it went along the way. When the legislature passed a law that allowed admission of out-of-court video interviews of sexual abuse victims, children under the age of 14, then that allowed organizations like Semo-Nasv to do a careful, non-manipulative interview with the child to try to get as much of a pristine version of that as possible. Initially, there was a provision in the law that said that if the judge found the child would be harmed by testifying in open court, that you didn't have to have the child at trial at all, but that violates the defendant's Sixth Amendment right to confrontation in the courtroom. So you do have to have the child available to testify, but you can also show that videotape, which a lot of times when the defendant sees the videotape, that's the end of going to trial, which is the best possible outcome for the child.
There was a lot of education that I had to have on how the process worked, and as I learned, I was able to share with our victims how to navigate the criminal justice system and to begin that healing process with them. In 2007, I became a forensic interviewer. I did over 1,100 forensic interviews of children and adults in the time that I was a forensic interviewer between 2007 and 2019. I began testifying in court, and that was another level of really being able to help the cases, help the victims, to help them achieve justice. So I was able to testify about the training that I had received as a forensic interviewer and speak about sort of the conditions that exist when a child is sexually abused. So many juries don't understand why perhaps children might delay in disclosing, or why they may never tell anyone until many years later. Helping them understand a lot of the guilt and shame that goes along with this, and some of the tactics that the perpetrators do to facilitate this abuse was something that I found really rewarding from an education standpoint.
When I first started working for Semo-Nasv, I didn't really know what it was all about. And they were so short-handed there that a lot of times as a pediatric nurse, I was able to help out in the office. And I realize now just how important Semo-Nasv is to our community. Before Semo-Nasv, there was no place that a child could go to feel free to disclose what had happened to them and know that there are people there that care about them. From our forensic interviewers at the very beginning, to our medical examiners, to our counselors and victims advocates that go with children to the court process and let them know what's going to be happening and helping the parents. It is nothing that we ever had in Southeast Missouri, and it was so needed. And then we realized there's no place for adults to go either. So we started a rape crisis center. They not only do the medical exams with the adults and the forensic interviewers, but they're there for them. They're there to help them. They're there to help them get housing if they need it. They're there to help them mentally with what the trauma that they're going through. And it's so important that there's a place like NASV to help these people that are so underserved in our area. And without Semo-Nasv, they would have to go to St. Louis or Memphis to get the help that they needed.
One thing is, after we had been done evaluations for a while, we looked at it and said, why can we not offer these services to adults? And we looked at what was happening to adults that were showing up in the emergency room after they had been assaulted. And there was no one there. You know, they were not an emergency usually, so they had to wait a long time. There was not a process, consistent process for them. So we began doing evaluations of adults also.
We've really seen an increase in the importance of being trauma-informed, making sure that our victims, when they come to the agency, that they are given choice, that they are given information, that they feel ownership over their services. They've had so much power taken from them, and as they move from being a victim of that crime to being a survivor of that crime, we want them to be navigating that with our help and support, but making those choices themselves.
We know that sexual assault of a child or an adult is life-changing, and the trajectory going forward after that event is in our hearts is really dependent upon the level of support and care and guidance and counseling that they receive. And we want every child and every adult that experiences that to have the best outcome possible.
It means we're able to deal with the prosecution of abuse cases in a fair way and in a way that's humane to the victims.
So we love that trauma-informed care is at the center of what we do. It's important. The work that our therapists are doing to help these survivors make sense of what happened to them, make meaning out of it, and move towards a time that this isn't the only thing going on in their lives, that they can focus on moving forward, having families, being professionals, whatever it is that their dreams are.
It's been a rewarding thing to be able to hold people accountable when they do those terrible things. And NASV helps me get that done.
Unfortunately, sexual abuse is the #1 unreported crime in the United States. And so because it's unreported, people don't know about it and people don't talk about it. And so what I really wanted to achieve was letting people know who Semo-Nasv was. Being the development director, part of my goal of raising awareness to the community is also to talk about our prevention education piece with Green Bear and expanding that program.
I created the Green Bear Project in memory of baby Ty, who was a little boy I had in foster care. He came to me right before his second birthday, and he stayed until right after his second birthday. He was here with me for about 6 months. 3 months after he went home, he was killed by his biological parents. And I was having trouble dealing with it and was very depressed. And my father, who's a pastor, told me that I needed to get up and do something. And that's what I did. I started the Green Bear Project in memory of baby Ty. The reason I went to Semo-Nasv with my program is because I tried doing it by myself at first, and I wanted to talk to children about abuse. I wanted to let kids know what to do if they were being abused, which mainly is to tell a grown-up so the grown-up can help them.
I think it's been a great first year, and we have so much further to go, but we've been able to open Green Bear Junction and Discovery Playhouse, so we can reach homeschool families, we can reach out-of-towners that are coming into the community, or just even parents that know that it's happening at the schools but aren't completely aware of what the program is. They can experience that with their family and have those conversations.
We always said if we could help one kid, then we have done our job. We have done this in memory of Ty, and his memory will live on. And the first story we got that we heard about was a little girl that her mother heard her yelling out the window, "You're not my mom, you're not my mom." And she went out to see what was happening, and someone was actually trying to drag her daughter into a car and carry her away. And we got a letter from the mother, and we felt so good about that because that was the one. We helped one kid. Now we hear stories all the time from our forensic interviewers about children that after they have the interview, they ask, "What made you decide to disclose?" And they always say, "Well, Green Bear told me it was okay to tell."
I really am impressed with the growth of the agency, not only in how we're providing services, but also in how we're caring for our staff. The folks that do the services, that provide that care, are the most important asset that we have. And we're finding that investing in their mental health, investing in their work-life balance, and encouraging self-care and treatment of vicarious trauma is going to really shore them up to continue to take care of our survivors that they're working with.
We're getting a new building in Jackson, which is really exciting. I see for the future, I hope that we can have a satellite campus in the Boot Heel area so that we can provide even more support for those in the Boot Heel so they don't have to travel as far. I hope that we can expand our counseling team because we've learned that trauma and vicarious trauma affects those families so much, because we don't just provide counseling for the survivor, we also provide it for their family members, and we know that's so important to the healing process.
We can hire more counselors, we can have more exam rooms, we can have more victims advocates to go into the communities and help these children and adults that have been victimized. And it's because of the help of the community that we're able to do this. Donations and giving us land and giving us buildings. Without the community, we would not be where we are.
Most people don't know this, but I had the misfortune to grow up as a teenager experiencing the cycle of violence in my family. And so there's always been a very special place in my heart to protect those victims of violence, domestic violence and sexual violence. And so today, even though it's been 20 years since I retired from the police department, I walk often past the Semo-Nasv offices, and it makes me smile and know that we've done something really important throughout the last 20 years to diminish that fear and anguish and reduce the cycle of violence for victims in our communities.
I feel like helping folks be able to talk through some of that trauma that they've had, and now I know resources that I can provide them as well to help them through that process. So to me, that's just so important that I can help heal our community.
I believe vehemently in caring for victims and trying to help them get justice, but most importantly, helping them heal and go on to have, again, happy, healthy lives. This is my calling, this is my passion. Semo-Nasv has become a huge part of who I am as a person. I just can't say enough good things about our team and the staff that work for us. I'm just so proud of the evolution of Semo-Nasv that I've seen over the last 18 years.